Well, greetings. I'd like to welcome everybody this evening. Um, our guest speaker tonight is Darryl Pifer. I will allow him to introduce himself to everybody out there and tell you his topic. He is going to be doing a PowerPoint. So take it. I'll do a quick prayer here to ask God's blessing upon the meeting, unless we have yeah, and then we'll go from there. Great Creator God and Father in heaven, we come before you now asking for your intervention and your presence in this meeting. We ask for your blessing on the listening as well as the speaking, and a blessing upon the electronics and all the things that are involved with bringing everyone together to hear this message. So, Father, we turn this now over into your hands, and by the power and authority of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
All right, thank you, Don. And good evening, everyone. I know several of you know me, and last I spoke to on this, I think it's been a while, but the presentation was on our Father's tremendous love for us. And tonight's related. Well, it's a different topic, but it's related because everything's built upon that great love. Donna wanted me to introduce myself, and my name is Darryl. That's what people call me anyway. And I have been involved with Sabbath and a walk since beginning of my life, since before I was born, and it just continues to grow. And I'm at a place and understand that what we need is to seek our Father, to be in relationship with Him, and it is about trusting Him and knowing Him, that He is who He is. And we seek Him and we learn from His Word in the Scriptures. So what I wanted to do, the presentation tonight, which I do have a PowerPoint which will go through, so you won't have to just look at me on the screen, is a topic that I've been thinking about for quite some time, actually. And some of the specific things in the presentation have emerged as I've been studying it further and more deeply in preparation for this presentation, since Don asked me if I would be willing to present a month and a half ago. And some that I didn't really even grasp or didn't see in a particular way until even yesterday. But it's a developing and growing thing, but I think it's very important. And as I said, every part of our walk is rooted in the fact that He loves us and that we are special to Him, and it is drawing us in a drawing of us into relationship with Him, and that is the fundamental and most important thing. So what I want to do is set this up, and I'll start with the PowerPoint, so you don't have to look at me. Not just so you don't have to look at me, but then you have something visual. And all of the slides, if anyone's interested at the end, I can make this available to everyone that's desirous of it. So I'll start that, finding my way to it. Hopefully, we will. Now, if I did that right, we should have the first slide up. Now, on my screen, that's all I see is my slide. So I am assuming that everything is working right, and I hope it is.
Give it another minute or two, Darryl.
Yeah, I will give it a minute.
Through the internet to us yet.
Okay, well, let me know, Don, that when the first slide shows up, so that I know that that I pushed the right buttons and that we are progressing properly. Screen sharing has started on my end, so I think we're there. And I know it takes a lag time.
Okay. I have it here. Hopefully everyone else has it.
Okay, good. Thank you. The topic, leadership, marriage, and unity, or the title and the topic. And again, as we go through this, hopefully the relationship between these will become clear. All right, so it's just this fancy PowerPoint that I've set up. And as Don said here, I'm really taxing the limits of the internet because my presentation is stored on and being presented on from the cloud because it's on Google Drive. All right, I want to start with some conclusions. These are the conclusions and some of the things. This is our starting point, actually. And then we will go in and we'll look at and explore these conclusions. And I like sometimes to hear and have conclusions that perhaps sound and seem shocking, because when we're shocked, sometimes it causes us to take a second glance at something, to look at something more deeply and more carefully. So I just wanted to say that ahead of time. And with these conclusions, this is what we will explore and see. Number one, the husband is not in charge of the wife. Just going to read these, and we will spend time delving into each one of these as we continue. Leadership, one of the fundamental topics to be discussed. Leadership is not rulership. We are all to be leaders. We have been all called to be leaders. And the fourth conclusion is that unity requires godly, proper leadership. Unity being oneness. And we will explore that a little bit, of course, in more detail as we look at and explore each one of these conclusions that I wanted to put up in the beginning up front. Some observations. Okay, I saw a message that the slides are taking a long time to show. I know that there is a lag, and I don't know if there's a way that I can do anything about that. So I will, if I have to leave the slides, I can, and then you'll just have to write furiously to keep up because I do have them printed out for myself to help keep me on. Wanted to share some observations. Things that I think are sort of the statements of the way I see it, and that help to situate the topic. We need to understand what it is to lead. And this is a fundamental and important part of the whole topic and what we're looking at. We need to understand and know what it means to lead. And I think we've had a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of misunderstanding around us in the churches, within assemblies, within families and marriages. So that's the number one thing, that we need to understand what it is to lead. We need godly leadership in our relationships. It is imperative that we have the right kind of leadership. And leadership means that we need leaders. And our relationships and the health of our relationships is dependent upon the quality of the leadership. Unfortunately, it is too easy for us to operate with mistaken notions. And I say this knowing that I have myself operated with mistaken notions, not understanding what leadership is, not grasping the clear even instructions the scriptures give us about what leadership is. And I'll give you an example. As I grew up, there was a whole clergy system that was in place. And if we look in churches, we will see that there are a ton of clerics that are leaders by title and position. And as we go through this, hopefully it becomes clear that they are not necessarily leaders by function. And there is a big distinction to be made. situating this discussion and consideration of leadership within the context of marriage. And it's not just in marriage, but understanding leadership through marriage and unity in light of leadership and marriage all tied together. I wanted to start with what I will call the curse of rulership. And this is specifically in the realm of marriage by going back to Genesis 3:16, where a curse was explained, was pronounced. Adam and Eve had eaten of the fruit that they were told not to eat, and there were curses that were pronounced. Cursed to be the ground, and so forth. Notice the curse that was spoken to Eve. To the woman he said, I greatly increase your sorrow and your conception, bring forth children in pain, and your desire is for your husband, and he does rule over you, and he shall rule over you. The first part of that, the woman's desire for her husband, that is not the curse. It's not that she desires her husband. That is not a curse. The curse is the second part of what was pronounced there. The curse is that the husband shall rule over her. This is the premise. This is understanding, looking at the scripture and saying, what does it say? And we look at that, and it was pronounced as a curse. The curse is the husband ruling over her. So let's look at this and understand that what it means to desire is to long for, to crave. That's not the curse. And I think if we examine it and we look at it, we will find that wives do desire their husbands. Frankly, for some wives, if they didn't, they wouldn't put up with those men. Sad to say. An example of where the same word in the Hebrew is used of desire is in Song of Solomon, chapter 7 and verse 10. And then this is an allegory of our relationship with Messiah. And it says, I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me. It's a wonderful and a beautiful thing and a natural thing. And I think that what is being said in Genesis 3:16, that her desire is for her husband, that is what it's meant to be. That was what was created in her. The curse is her being ruled over by her husband. That is the curse. When we look up what rule over is, we find the word is in Hebrew is mashal, and that means to rule, to have dominion, to reign over. And throughout so much of history, and even wherever, many places we can look, we see that that has been true, that men have had dominion over their wives, where they have not had voice, they have not had any significant role. In many cases, they are not much more than slaves. An example of the use of that word is in Judges 8:23, and Gideon said to them, those that said, we want to make you our leader, our ruler. And he says, I won't rule over you. That's the word mashal. And my sons will not rule over you. Again, mashal. He says, Yehovah, the Lord, will rule, mashal, over you. Remember in the example with when the Israelites asked for a king, and Samuel went to Yehovah, and Yehovah said, Samuel, they have not rejected you, they're rejecting me as their king. And he gave them a man to rule over them, but he was their king and to have been their king. And that's what Gideon was telling his compatriots. Yehovah rules over you. Now, some of you are probably saying, wait a minute, hold on. This can't be right. We must be missing something. You're leaving something out of this that's really important. Doesn't Paul say that the husband is the head of the wife? Doesn't he say that? Well, actually, yes, he does. Ephesians 5:23, for the husband is the head of the wife. Sounds pretty clear. 1 Corinthians 11:3. The head of a wife is her husband. So Paul did say the husband is the head of the wife. But don't forget, while we're here, Ephesians 5:22. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Now, I feel I have to mention that as a youngster, I remember several sermons, or at least the topic of the sermons, being on marriage, and I don't really remember very many, if any, more verses than these being used. Now, I'm sure there probably was because I wasn't married and I wasn't really paying attention. But definitely, wives, submit to your husbands was one that was pointed out and one that was emphasized. When we look at these verses later on, in a little while, in the context of what leadership is, we will see what it means, I hope, for the husband to be the head. And we will see what it means for the wife to submit to the husband, as those verses show. But we will have to look at more than just those verses. Okay, the key in all of this is leadership. So we're going to spend a little time looking at leadership as a general topic to understand what is being told to the husbands and the wives by Paul and also by Peter specifically. We need the right understanding about what leadership is. Okay, if we are going to apply leadership, if we are going to be leaders, as one of those conclusions at the beginning was, we are all to be leaders. We need to understand what it is. And then additionally, we need the right application of the right understanding. Just understanding it won't be enough. We need to apply it in the proper way. So we need a right understanding and we need a right application of the right understanding. So we're going to look at some of the words of our Messiah, Yeshua. We're going to look in the scriptures and see. And one thing to note is that Yeshua, he turned a lot of notions on end. He upset the apple cart in more ways than one. One of those things that he did was in the area of leadership. So we need to look and see, what does he tell us? What can we learn by what he turned upside down from our common understandings and notions? One of those places that we can start, and we're going to look at these fairly quickly so that we'll have time for discussion when we get through all of this, is Matthew 18, the first 6 verses. We're going to see something familiar in these next few passages that we look at. One of those familiar things is the disciples arguing about who is the greatest. So in verse 1 of Matthew 18, at that time, the disciples came to Yeshua and said, who then is or will be the greatest in the kingdom of the heavens? What did Yeshua do? He called a little child and he set him down in their midst and he said, unless you turn, you change and become as little children, you won't even make it into the kingdom. Whoever then humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of the heavens. And whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones to stumble, it's better he was just drowned with a millstone around his neck. Okay, so in response to a dispute about who's the greatest, Yeshua said, it's whoever humbles himself like this child. That's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, the one who is humble, small like a child. And whoever receives, embraces, accepts, and even follows that child, that one has received and accepted and embraced me. Matthew 23, just a few chapters further on, he speaks more of leadership. You know, Matthew 23, I think of as the woe, woe, woe chapter, because there are many woes pronounced against the scribes and the Pharisees. The scribes and the Pharisees, they were the religious leaders of the time. They were the ones that were looked up to. And you know what? They wanted to be looked up to. And Messiah speaks of them as being what they are, hypocrites. They were interested in what they looked like and the privileges that they were able to gain from it, the best seats, being called Great One, being called special. But Yeshua said, don't be like these guys. They've got it all wrong. He said in verse 11, the greatest among you is your servant. He further said, you aren't to be called rabbi or master because you have one teacher and one master. In verse 8, he says, and you are all brothers. There aren't these divisions and distinctions within you, your ranks, that here is one who is higher and better, and here he is superordinate, and you are subordinate. He says there's not a hierarchy here. You have one master, one teacher, and I think we know who that is. You are all brothers. In Mark chapter 9, verses 33 to 37, well, we have another debate among the disciples. Who is the greatest? That's what they seem to like to discuss and argue about. And Yeshua gives them the same instruction. If anyone is going to be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. If you're going to be first, you're going to be in the lead, you must be the servant. You must be last. Okay, let's just bring together a few conclusions from these verses. To be first, you must be last and least, like a child, small and humble. To be first, you must be a servant. You know, being a servant makes you the head, at the head, the one in front. See, we think head, and if I think head in terms of this is the somebody special, the one who is the great one, then I miss the point here. You aren't a servant because you are first, because you're at the head. You are first at the head because you are a servant. You turn the apple cart completely upside down on this. We can also see that whoever accepts the one serving, which is the leader, because remember, serving makes the one the leader. Whoever accepts that one accepts Messiah, because to do that is to be like Messiah. So in this concept, or in this way, to accept, to receive, would be to follow that example that is set. The servant manifests Messiah in the flesh by being like him, by doing like him. Now we are all called to be like Messiah. We're all called to be servants. Therefore, it's a logical conclusion. It follows through. If we are called to be servants like our Messiah, then we are called to be leaders. Now, I know that sometimes we're just like, no, I don't really want to be a leader. I don't want that. Well, guess what? It's what you're called to. There's no way around it. Sometimes what we don't want to be the leader that's the head honcho, the guy in charge. Great. I don't want to be that either. We were called to be leaders, real leaders, not the Pharisaical, hypocritical type. That is a position, not a function. Okay, Matthew 10, chapter 10, verses 24 and 25. These are well worth reading here. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher and the servant to be like his master. We aren't going to be greater than our master, our teacher, who Yeshua said is him. We know that. It is enough. It is proper. It is good for us to be like him. He is our goal. Our goal is to become like our teacher and our master. That is enough, not greater than him. So we need to look and see what example he set and not try to supersede that. Another example, Matthew 24, verses 45 to 51. Here we have a little story, a little scenario that Yeshua shares that we can learn a great deal from. Matthew 24. I'm just going to look at that real quick. We can talk about that briefly. Who then is a trustworthy and wise servant, whom his master set over his household to give them food in season? To give who? Them, those in his household. Blessed is that servant whom his master, having come, shall find so doing. Truly I say to you that he shall set him over all his possessions. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master is delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunkards, the master of that servant shall come on a day when he doesn't expect it, and an hour he does not know, and he's in big trouble. So the fellow servant cares, or the faithful servant cares for his fellow servants. And that word in the Greek is sundulos. His fellow servants. Notice, he is not greater than them. He is a servant of the master, and his job was to care for them, to feed, to share what the master had given for them. The wicked servant, though, he thinks he is a master. He takes care of himself, eating and drinking to excess. And he beats his fellow servants. And the only way to get away with doing that, with beating them, is to assume that he is greater than them, that he is more worthy and privileged than they are. And the reason to beat them is to get them to do what he wants them to do. That is a wicked servant, not one that we should emulate. We should be the one that is faithful, who is caring for his fellow servants. In John 13, Messiah, Yeshua, gets up from the table, sets aside his garments, and washes his disciples' feet. You know, we're not that far from when we, observe the Passover and we think about that night that he did this. He became a servant. And he said, you don't understand what I'm doing. But wait a minute. If we look back in Luke 22, verse 24, you see that he interrupted a dispute about who was the greatest. This was that same night. They were saying, who is the greatest, and arguing. Picture the scene. Our Messiah hears them in this argument, knows what they're talking about, gets up from the table, lays aside his garment, gets down on his hands and knees, and begins to wash their dirty feet. I'm sure it got very quiet in that room. And he said to them, you don't understand what I'm doing. You don't grasp this. He said, you call me teacher and master. And you say, well, for I am. And remember, it is enough for us to be like our teacher and master. He says in verse 14, then if I, master and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I give you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is an emissary greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. You know, I used to think that he was telling us that we should once a year wash somebody else's feet, but that's not what he said to do. He said, you should do as I'm doing. You're arguing about who's the greatest, using the wrong criteria of leadership. And he showed them what it was, the greatest of all time. He came to us as a servant, laid aside his garments to set the example, and says we should do as he does. He sets the example. He became the servant of those who are unworthy. He washed Judas's feet. He washed Peter's feet, who was going to deny him that night. Well, you and I are unworthy. He died for us. He washes our feet with his blood. He, the greatest one, humbled himself as a servant, the lowest of servants, and said, do as I do. Follow my example. We are to do as he did, to serve others, including those who are unworthy, just like we are. That includes those around us in our churches, our assemblies. That even includes those within our even closer. Includes our spouses. The servant is not greater than his master. The servant is to become like his master. That is our calling. We are to be like him. So we need to understand what is the example he set. Our master humbled himself as a servant. In Philippians 2:7, Paul explains that he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. We are to be conformed to his image. You're not greater than him. The best that we can be is like him. We are called to be like him, not different. And if we do emulate him, manifest him in the flesh. See, John talks about that in his epistle, about denying Messiah in the flesh. That means that we're not being like him in our flesh. But if we do manifest him, follow his example and his teachings, we are blessed. We receive blessings. If we receive those who are his, receive them, embrace them, and care for them, that is receiving him. As we do unto the little ones, we have done unto him. So we have to know who is my master, that I have to serve. Whose servant am I? In Romans chapter 6, Paul tells us an answer to that question of who is my master. He says, do you not know, in verse 16 of Romans 6, that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? Don't you know that? Thanks be to Elohim, God, that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed. and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness. We are to be slaves of righteousness, slaves unto our master who bought and paid for us. Whoever and whatever I submit myself in obedience to is the one who is my master. I should be obedient to my master's standards, the ones that Messiah sets and gives. That standard is righteousness. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, Matthew 6:33. You know, we could spend this evening in Matthew chapters 5 through 7 talking about righteousness and looking at that in the context of leadership. Because when we go into that, which it's not what we're going to do, it gets really personal there. Lording it over. It shall not be so among you. We know who said that. Our Messiah said that. Yeshua said, no, you're not supposed to lord it over anyone. It shall not be so. And that's in Matthew 20, Luke 22, Mark 10, all important scriptures, passages when he teaches us about leadership. He teaches us that the world's approach to leadership is wrong. Now, I have heard before church that went to great lengths to try to establish a hierarchy within its ranks. Well, one of the things that would show up if you look at it in Matthew 20, and when it says the princes or the rulers of the Gentiles, and the word for prince or ruler is the Greek archon, and when you look up archon and you look up the word hierarchy, that word that archon comes from, arch, is in hierarchy. Look it up on Wikipedia sometime. He said, it shall not be so. Messiah's teachings turn the conventional concept of leadership on its head. He says it is wrong. He used in there the Greek word katakurio, lorded over. Notice part of that word, the last part, kurio. In Greek, what is the word for Lord, for master? Kurios. It's that word. Kata means over and above. Lorded over. It's a very good translation, actually. Well, that word shows up in another place in the scriptures, besides in Matthew 20 or Mark 10, Luke 22, shows up in 1 Peter 5:3. Peter in 1 Peter 5 is talking to older believers. Now, you'll say, wait a minute, it says elders, and I know what an elder is. Well, elder means elder, older. He's talking about older believers. If you want to talk about that later, we will, but that's not where I'm intending to go. But I wanted to point out, when he speaks to them, he says, neither as being masters, katakurio, over those entrusted to you, or those of the heritage of the Almighty, but being examples to the flock. Pardon me. Let me get a drink real quick. And be reminded, it shall not be so among you. That's our Messiah. Go ahead and load all the parts of this slide, because I had it where, whoops, would come in one line at a time. And since there's a lag, I'm trying to do it so that it fits with my words, not just, so that hopefully the two are together. And I can't tell if they are or not, because on my screen it's immediate. The instructions given in Matthew 20 regarding leadership that are repeated in Mark 10 and Luke 22, they're really quite simple. Yeshua says that leadership is grounded in being a servant. He was consistent whenever he talked about leadership in these contexts. Leadership is not about being in charge. Leadership is not about commanding and controlling. Leadership is about humbly serving, forgiving, and caring, even dying for those who are unworthy. Leadership is about righteousness, not power. And leadership is about being like our Messiah, the Master. And if you will notice that he was every one of these things. He was a servant. You may say, well, he was in charge. He was the master. Yeah, but did he come exercising authority, lording it over and saying, you do this or you will be scourged? He didn't do that. He died. He humbled and submitted himself unto death. That is our example. Not what we think he is as king and mighty one. What he was in the flesh. He didn't command and control. He humbly served, he forgave, he cared for, and he died for us. And we were yet sinners and enemies when he did so. He washed the one who betrayed him. He washed his feet. Leadership is about righteousness. All right, let's see. Can it be simplified? Can we simplify leadership? And yes, we can. In fact, it's already done for us. Messiah actually, I think, was pretty clear about it. He simplified it really well. But here's another one. Exodus 13 and verse 21. And the Lord. Okay, something happened to my screen sharing. We will come back to this. Hello? Okay. No? Are we still sharing it? Because it said it stopped. Hopefully it didn't.
Last I see is the last screen that you were talking about. It shall not be so among you.
Okay. Well, there should be one. It should have leadership simplified at the top, but I will restart it. So I'm going to stop it for a brief moment. Hi there. And turn it back on. We'll see if that works. All right. It says it started.
Yeah, it's still loading on our end.
Okay.
It's here.
Okay. I'm going to put it up on the full screen then, and we'll continue. Exodus 13 and verse 21. And Jehovah, the Lord, went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way. And by night, okay. And by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. He went before them. Whoops. I had that before. We'll just put it on there. Here we have leadership simplified, and it means really simply to walk in front of or to walk in the face of. That's what went before. And here we see it says went before to lead them. Jehovah led the Israelites by walking in the path they were to take, showing the way. Real simple. It's the one who goes before. Scripturally defined leadership then has certain characteristics, which we've been covering, but we're going to reiterate. Requires humility, like a child, like a servant. There's not room for arrogance or thinking one is greater. It is based upon serving. It is not hierarchical. There aren't ranks in in the master's leadership structure. It elevates the least as the greatest. The greatest doesn't become the least is the greatest. It requires being like Messiah. It is based in righteousness because it is being like him who was righteous. It is guiding by showing the way through example. If we're not setting the example, we're not showing the way. It is going first by humbling yourself as a servant. And it is loving others in action. And we know the great commandments. You shall love your brother as yourself. John says if we don't do that, then we say we love our Father, yet we are still a liar because we're not loving as he loved. Leadership is a function. It's not a position. And if we think of it as a position, we will follow the wrong things. It is a function. Yeshua was really very clear. He said, servants are leaders. It's that simple. He didn't say leaders are servants. He said servants are leaders. They're the ones that are like him. Okay, so let's transition. It's not really a transition, but extend this then into our understanding and the conclusions that I started with. We need to talk specifically about marriage. What is the goal of marriage? Well, the goal of marriage is not that we somehow are comfortable, although there is great comfort to be derived from marriage. The goal of marriage is oneness. It is unity. And we can see that in Genesis 2:24. Our Father said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and he shall hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. When Yeshua was asked about divorcing one's wife, what did he tell them? He said, you guys don't get it. It's because of your own hardness of heart that Moses permitted this, that it was permitted through Moses. He said, don't you understand the reason from the beginning? That you were to become one. The husband and wife were to become one. When he prayed to his Father and said about them being one, and may those who follow and believe be one also. Same kind of notion here. Becoming one with our spouses requires being like Messiah. We have to have proper leadership, proper servanthood leadership. It must exist in order for this goal to be realized. And additionally, I need to get it right in my own house before I can get it right somewhere else. Proper relation to the Almighty and to my spouse is to have a bondservant mentality. A bondservant mentality. What does that mean? Well, let's look at that. In Exodus 21, verses 1 through 6, we find the instruction about a bondservant. He gotten himself into trouble and he was sold to pay his debts. All right, so he serves his master, and the 7th year he goes free. But the servant says, I love my master. I don't want to go somewhere else. And so he has an awl driven through his ear into the doorpost, and he becomes his servant forever. That's the story. Think about the bondservant's approach and perspective toward his master. Okay? We can see this clearly in a spiritual realm that we are bound as servants of the Almighty. We're joined to him forever. We were baptized into this. We accepted this, and that is forever. Well, what about marriage? Does the bondservant mentality apply to marriage? Well, it's a lifelong oath and covenant that we made. To do what? Forever. As long as we live, to love, to care for, to provide, etc. Did we not have our ear pierced with the awl with marriage? There is a parallel, and we're going to see that, and we already know that. Paul tells us there's a parallel. But I need to ask, do I approach my marital relationship with the mentality of a bondservant, bound for life? Do I think of that? Because remember, the bondservant chose his master because he loved him, said, I want to be with him forever. I want to serve him. I want to serve him. Do I have that approach and mentality? Okay, so now we are going to move to Ephesians, because that's really where, we started out there and I said, well, didn't Paul say that the husband is the head? Yeah, he did. So let's go to Ephesians. We're not going to jump right into Ephesians 5 because, one of the things that we need to learn or need to do is to get the context. It's really important. So in this case, we have a context, and we got to start, and we probably could start at the beginning of the book, but we're going to run out of time. Wow, time flies by anyway, really fast. So we look at some things in Ephesians 4. His whole discussion, Paul's whole discussion in Ephesians 4, revolves around unity and our being like Messiah. Okay, from the very beginning, he gives us an instruction in the first 3 verses. He says, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, or a bondslave of the Lord our master, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you've been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. It says a whole lot in those 3 verses. Walk worthy, in a manner worthy of the calling. What have you been called? To be like Messiah. He tells us that later in the chapter. You've been called to be like Messiah, so walk like it, with humility and gentleness and patience, with forbearance, with mutual submission in love, endeavoring to keep the oneness that is supposed to exist. In verses 11 through 14, well, verse 11, I've heard that's supposed to be ranks. These are the different ranks of the ministry. No, they're not. They're functions. They're not offices. And they were told what they're for building up, for edifying. The goal is for everyone to become servants like Messiah. The King James obscures this notion of servanthood, calls it ministry. Well, that's a good word, but it's been misused. A minister, where I used to look at it, was not a servant. A minister was a special class of believer or member of the church. No, it's a servant, like Messiah. And we are all to become servants like him and be like him. We are to be conformed to him, to be as he is. To grow in maturity, which results in oneness within the body. Romans 8:29 says we are to be conformed to the image of Messiah in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. Oh, the first, that's the head. That's the one that goes first. The first is the least. The first is the servant. And that's what he was. Hey, so when we continue from Ephesians 4, and we didn't cover everything there, we're just some highlights, but we really need to spend time there. But it continues into Ephesians 5. Verses 1 and 2, be imitators of God as beloved children. Walk in love. as Christ, as Messiah loved us and gave himself up for us. Wait a minute, you get that? Walk in love as Messiah did it, giving himself up for us. We do the same thing. It's a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Walk as Messiah walked. Imitate the true and righteous one. That's leadership. Mimic our Father. You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Be merciful even as your Father is merciful. Both Matthew 5 and Luke 6. Walk in love. Messiah is the example. 1 John 3:16, by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us. We ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. In Galatians 5:14, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's all in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 5. But now let's jump ahead to verses 22 to 33. But even before we do that, we need to understand them in the context of our calling, of what leadership is, of what servanthood is, what headship is, and submission, and what oneness is. Because if we take verse 22 out of context of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5, where he talks about our calling to be like Messiah, to be leaders as servants, to set an example of submission and oneness, if we take verse 22 of chapter 5 out of this context, it becomes meaningless. We don't get the meaning. If we don't understand the context, we will make a false conclusion. And we'll say the husband is in charge of the wife. Because we'll read that in verse 23 and we'll say he's the head. That means he's in charge. Is that what Paul says, though? Is that what that means? Obviously, because I'm asking that question and the things I've said, I'm saying no, it doesn't mean that. So we need to see, what does Paul say? I'll just go ahead and push the button and load all of this slide instead of one at a time, because I'm assuming that there still is a lag there. So let's give it a chance to load. Ephesians 5:21, Paul speaks of submitting one to another. Okay? He's been speaking about a need for mutual submission, about a need for us to each be like Messiah. Then, in verse 22, he says, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Well, wait, in the context of what Paul's been talking about, does this mean that it is the wife's duty to submit, not the husband's also? Verse 21 indicates that yes, it is. What he says in the rest of the context is, yes, husbands should submit too. 5:23, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Messiah is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. The husband is the head like Messiah is the head. This doesn't mean to be the ruler or the king over. It means to be the greatest by being like Yeshua, by being a servant. To be the head means to go first. It means to lead. Messiah went first, and he said, do what I do. Follow my example. He set the example for us, just like Jehovah going in the cloud before Israel, led them in the way. Paul explains that the husband has the responsibility of going first in marriage. It's his job to submit and serve like Messiah. It's his job to be the least. Why does he say that? Probably because of that curse. Because too often we're kind of dense. And so we need to be knocked over the head and told, do it. Because somebody has to go first. Verse 24. Now, as the church submits to Messiah, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Well, we as believers submit to Messiah. How? By becoming like him. Being conformed and transformed into his image. The husband's charged with being the least one first. Not waiting for his wife to do it, but husbands, do it first. Then guess what's going to happen? You have set an example of walking in the way that the wife can and will follow. Verse 25, husbands, love your wives as Messiah loved the church and gave himself up for her. You understand how heavy that is? This is how the husband is to be the head, by loving his wife like Messiah loved the church and died for it. The husband is to give everything for his wife. That is what it means to be the head, to lead. He loves his Messiah, giving himself for her. There's no room for selfishness. There's no room for unrighteousness in that. A great responsibility is placed on the husband in this. He is to be like Messiah to his wife. He is charged with walking in the way first. Verses 26 and 27, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle, or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Husbands, my conduct and actions are to sanctify my wife. Being like Messiah is to edify and equip her. If I'm not being the head, the servant, I'm inhibiting that growth. See, husbands have been given a great responsibility. Verse 23, or maybe it's not 23. Nevertheless, in the same way, husbands should love their wives, should be 28, as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. We are to do it the same way Messiah did it. Don't love yourself more than her. Don't give yourself more privilege and status than she has. Don't value your ideas, your desires and gifts more than hers. Don't treat your wife worse, or do I treat my wife worse than I treat myself? I'm tired, there's dishes to be washed, I might go to bed. Well, now, am I treating myself, treating her worse than I treat myself? We shouldn't. The wife is part of the husband, and the goal is to be one. Being a servant builds oneness because it is an expression of love. That's how it happens. We build oneness by serving, by being like Messiah. Verse 32, Paul says this mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Messiah and the church. The spiritual implications are applicable from marriage to the body and from the body to marriage. We understand one in the other. We learn how to become one with our spouse, and what we learn translates into being one with other believers because it's the same process. It's the same way being servants. It all depends upon leadership, which is to be a servant. Verse 33, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Be like Messiah to your wife will lead to respect. Her desire, Genesis 3:16, is for you, her husband. We love our Father. We love God because he first loved us. 1 John 4:19. That love is a transformative love, and it changes. The wife already desires her husband. But when he is like Messiah to her, she responds, just to be loved and honored and cherished. All right, we need to think about something there from this whole exchange, this whole section, and that is that these instructions, although directed to wives and to husbands in two individual seemingly different ways, that these instructions are applicable to both husbands and to wives because women are called to be like Messiah just as much as men are. Messiah is the goal for all of us. The husband's charged with being the first, the head, because someone must go first. And if we respond according to the curse, we won't. Too often, men are just too lazy or too insecure to man up. Sad to say, but it is true. So Paul's instructions leave no room for equivocation. He says, get off your duff and do it. Who's the first to be like Messiah in your marriage? It's a shame if it's not you. Well, Peter speaks on the same topic in 1 Peter 3. And again, just like in Ephesians, we really need to look at the context. So we could look at things from 1 Peter chapter 1, 1 Peter chapter 2, before we get to chapter 3. Just some highlights. Again, just some highlights because we want to get to chapter 3 of 1 Peter. Now, if I could just turn to it in my scriptures, it would help. In 1 Peter 1, verses 14 and 15, he says to be obedient. Not like you used, don't be like you used to be, but be holy, be set apart, like the one who called you. That's who we're to be like. It says in chapter 1, verse 22, love one another earnestly from a pure heart. From the heart. This isn't just action. This is who you are. Chapter 2, the first 3 verses, he says to be pure, to be simple, to be humble, just as we have experienced Messiah. That's how he is. Verse 12 of chapter 2, others should see you, should see what you do, and they should give glory to our Father in heaven. Verse 16 of chapter 2, we should live as servants of God. He's the master. Verse 21, this is our calling, to be like Messiah, even in suffering, even though it's hard and we suffer for it. Verse 23, Messiah's example for us is he didn't abuse, he didn't threaten in word or deed when he suffered. He didn't get mad, call names, yell. He didn't do that. He humbled himself as a servant unto death. He committed it all to his Father in heaven. Verse 24, he suffered and died in order to make us a perfect bride. And that is our example. Now, chapter 3, because we know where he starts off, he says something to the wives. He says, likewise. Likewise. That means in the same way. He's saying, this is related to what I've just said. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. He says, wives, be subject to your husbands, submit to them, because they're disobedient. And if you do so, your conduct may win them over so that they may be converted. That's what it says. Wives, be subject to your husbands because they're disobeying. And if you do so, you set the right example. Who's being the servant? Who is the leader in this scenario? In these first 2 verses. In the next verses 3 and 4, He says, don't let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold, jewelry, and or the clothing you wear. But let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. He's not saying what you wear isn't important. He's saying what you wear is not what is going to win your husband over from his disobedience. He is saying what will do it is what is on the inside. It is the beauty of Messiah in you that will affect the disobedient husband. He says in verses 5 and 6 that this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by submitting to their own husbands. That's what they did. They adorned themselves by submitting to their own husbands, adorned themselves in righteousness. They adorned themselves like Messiah. As Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you're her children. If you do good, do not fear anything that is frightening. There are many others who have walked the same road. Husbands that were not doing what they should be doing, walking in righteousness, even ruling over them because of the curse. Those women, their hope was in God. They knew that as they conformed themselves to him and his ways, that they were waiting on him to act in their husbands' lives. They submitted and humbled themselves as Messiah. What Peter describes as women that were and are the leaders in their marriages because their husbands weren't doing it. Now you say, wait about Sarah and Abraham. Look, we can read in there and see that Abraham did not always obey as he was supposed to. We don't even need to argue that, I don't think. He was a man. So there are times when all of us, when I and you are not walking in the path as we should, and our wives set the example for us. Okay? Verse 7. Likewise, husbands. Oh, that likewise thing again. Meaning in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So, he says this applies to you husbands in the same way. Live in an understanding way. What does that mean? Well, I think that means knowing, understanding Messiah and being like him. That's what we're supposed to do. We are supposed to be obedient, not disobedient like the husband in verse 1. He says, husbands, be what Peter described for the wife. Be as Messiah. Show honor to your wife, and I like this translation better. Show honor to your wife as to fine china. You know, weaker vessel. That's some colloquialism or something that I don't think we really understand. It makes us think of a wife as weak and of less, physically many wives are weaker, women are. But I don't think that's really what's meaning. Fine china speaks to something. Treat your wife as fine china, as a precious and beautiful and valuable item. It's something to be handled with care, love, respect, humility, gentleness, patience. That's the fruit of the Spirit. Notice also in this verse that Peter says the husband and wife, they are fellow heirs. Isn't that something? Messiah told us that we're all brothers. He said that we are fellow servants. Peter says, look, your wife, men and women are fellow heirs. One's not greater than the other. We are on an equal footing as fellow servants and fellow heirs. He says husbands do this so that your prayers won't be hindered. And our prayers are hindered when we are separated from God. through our own disobedience, when we're not being as Messiah to her. We are not established in the relationship with our Father as we should be. But to treat our wives as fine china, to be the leaders that we should be, to be as Messiah to her, then there isn't this disconnect in our relationship with Messiah. In fact, our relationship with Messiah, our relationship with our wife is a blessing because we have that relationship with our Father. Verse 8 of 1 Peter 3, finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. All of you, everyone, not just husbands and wives. He says all of you should be doing this. We should be united in our pursuit of being like our Messiah. Sympathy, bearing one another's burdens. Brotherly love, that's a life of action like Messiah. A tender heart, which is one full of compassion. A humble mind, as friendly as companions, not elevating yourself as greater. We should all be like Messiah, loving, serving, giving. I said some of that in 1 Peter 3, I didn't actually understand that way and with that kind of that clarity until yesterday. But I think it says it in there. I think it's quite clear. In fact, so much of my time yesterday was spent paring scriptures out of this presentation, and already it's gone longer than I had expected, and I'm not done. So I'm going to keep going for just a little while longer. What is it to be a leader when there is disagreement? Well, Romans 14 gives us an example. Basically, we should yield our rights, what we know is okay and right, in order to bear with the weakness of others. Paul says, so then let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding. Do not, for the sake of food or any other thing, destroy the work of God. You know, everything is indeed clean. I know what I can eat. This meat's okay, he says. But it is wrong for me or anyone to make another stumble by what he eats. It's good not to eat meat. It's good not to drink wine or to do anything that causes my brother to stumble. Put that into marriage. Don't do something that causes your spouse or brother to stumble. If it is offensive and wrong and it causes problem and difficulties for your spouse, don't do it. You're causing him or her to sin if you require him or her to do something. And if you do cause this offense, cause this kind of problem, it's a sin for you. You are doing wrong. So submitting for the sake of oneness is more important than asserting your rights. Paul could have said, I have a right to eat meat. But he says, I won't eat it at all if it's going to be a problem for my brother. I do that for my wife. Would I rather be right and live for my rights? Or will I be righteous and lay down my life? The leader must give in at impasses for the sake of oneness. A bondservant mentality in marriage. Here's what it means. Just pull that down. Again, I set up these slides to each line to come on one at a time. And with the lag, I'm assuming it's better if I load them all the way. A bondservant mentality in marriage means your time is no longer your own. Thanks, Jeff. You really don't have rights. I mean, we do have rights, but our rights do not trump the rights of our spouse. For example, 1 Corinthians 7. I know that there are husbands who have used 1 Corinthians 7 in order to be intimate with their wives. Your body's not your own, it belongs to me. They're exercising their right because they're not reading the rest of what Paul says there. And that is that your body belongs to her. We have few rights, and we certainly don't have the right to impose upon the other. A bondservant mentality in marriage means that there's constant study to find new ways to better serve, that we develop new skills in order to better serve. We work to build the prestige and esteem of our spouses in the community and around in the assemblies. We treat our spouse's thoughts and opinions as valuable as our own. We don't dismiss them. You don't know what you're talking about. We don't get mad and upset and yell. A bondservant would never do that. Make room for your spouse to exercise his or her gifts. Make allowances for our spouse's weaknesses. And make allowances for our own. The bondservant loves his master as he loves himself. Paul says, you're supposed to love your wife as you love yourself. The bondservant is committed to helping his master fully live and blossom as a person. That's what Messiah is shown, Paul shows, did for the church, for his bride. The example that we're supposed to do. Without submission in our relationships, there is no real intimacy. Without submission in our relationships, there's no real oneness. The leader is the one who is first to submit, to do what's righteous. Now, oneness happens, as husbands, if we take that leadership role as the head and we go first. Our wives respond to it. They can't help it. It's created in them. Remember, there is a desire. It's created in them. It's not just being comfortable. Hey, there's absence of conflict. We're really good. Ask your wife if that's so, and hopefully she's able to tell you the truth. Some wives are afraid to tell their husbands because of how you have reacted before. James 4. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and you don't have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. What causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions, your lusts are at war within you? You desire and do not have, so you murder. What Messiah said about murder, if you hate your brother in your heart. You covet and you can't obtain. You want something and you try to get it, but you're not getting it. So you fight and you quarrel. We fight over perceived rights. We don't fight over righteousness. All right, we fight over perceived rights. I have the right to this, and I'm not getting it. We're not fighting over righteousness. We fight over selfishness. We're not fighting over being like Messiah. He didn't do that. Who is it that pursues righteousness and submits first? Well, that's the one who's the leader. And I can't be the servant as long as my rights factor into my decision-making process. Well, I really have the right to go out and have a beer with my buddies. So you're just going to take care of the kids and clean up things here in the house, and I'll see you. I've had a long day at work. I really need this. I can just take that. I should be willing to give up my rights for the sake of the one that I love. And it should be noted that often there is no fight because the wife passively submits. Sometimes because she's been taught and learned that the husband is in charge and she shouldn't have a voice. The absence of visible conflict is not oneness. Okay, I'm changing the slide, so hopefully in a minute it will change. Let me know if it doesn't, and then I will try to reset, because the thing said it started sharing and it stopped sharing. What it said, it could just be a lag in the machine somewhere. I have a responsibility to help my wife develop her own gifts. You know, I can say, well, she's my helpmeet. Helpmeet means she is a gift from my Father to help me. But then I'm supposed to be like Messiah, and becoming one with her, I must help her to edify and encourage her. Your spouse's weaknesses are as much a part of who she is as are her gifts, and neither one should be trampled. We should work together to purify one another. Marriage should be a transforming agent in my life. You know, none of us should be staying the same. We're supposed to be growing and changing. And there are going to be challenges, and they exist so that you will grow. As a servant, I teach through my actions how to love someone in spite of his or her weaknesses. We're called to bear one another's burdens. And that's all in order to help us to each become like Messiah. All right. We're called to bear one another's burdens with the goal of helping each other reach the standard of Messiah. That means I need to do the things that need done. It's about serving and giving. It's not about me waiting for my wife to do it. I need to deal with things the way they are. It's better with the slides, but I need to understand that my wife is my Father's precious daughter, and therefore, as a fellow heir and a fellow servant, she is also my sister. Do I treat her as that precious daughter of the Almighty? Do I take her for granted? Do I squelch her voice? Do I allow her to express her gifts? Do I treat her as that fellow heir with me? Do I consider myself to be an authority over her? Being as Messiah to her means that I do the things that build her up and help her become like Messiah. And as I said, this applies to both spouses, really. But I think it needs to be addressed from the context of Paul to the husbands first, and particularly because of the curse of Genesis 3:16, which is sort of our default. That's where we end up. You know, my wife is a blessing. And as a blessing, she sometimes does things that frustrate me, or things that remind me, or sometimes she reminds me of things that I don't want to be reminded of, or she shows me where and when I'm wrong. At the time that these things happen, I don't necessarily like any of it, but all of it is part of the blessing that she is to me. And it is part of my Father's work in me, which he has promised to complete. The work that we see is talked about in Philippians 1:6 and in Hebrews 12 as he disciplines and teaches and instructs us. So how I respond and act at those times when she points things out or she frustrates me because she is working as the servant of the Almighty in my life. Do I lay down my rights at those times? Do I nurse my wounded ego? Do I get upset and say or do things that I shouldn't do or shouldn't say? Do I treat her as less than a fellow heir because I'm afraid to face my own shortcomings and deal with them? You know, childlike tantrums are not appropriate. My wife is not someone to be treated that way. She's not my daughter to be corrected by me. She is a blessing. She is the daughter of Jehovah, and she's been entrusted to my care. Yelling, name-calling, the silent treatment, pointing out her faults. Yeah, well, you.
None of that should be happening. I should be mature enough to confront the reality of my own need to grow, my own shortcomings. And if she is there to point them out, then who am I to say, no, I don't want to know that? And to treat her with disrespect, because that's not the bondservant mentality. That's not what I've been called to. None of us have. Leadership, as we've seen, is not about being in charge. It's about encouraging and building up others, honoring their gifts, honoring my spouse's gifts, empowering others, sacrificing my own desires and my perspective for the other's sake. A situation of control leads to subversion, withdrawal, resentment, not oneness. An environment of control and wielding authority destroys oneness. Do I exist in marriage for my wife, or does she exist for me? Being a servant in marriage is not about keeping score. It's not about earning credit. It's not about saying, hey, I did this, you need to do something back. It is to be an expression of love that comes from the heart. What is my motive for serving her? Why do I do it? It should be out of love. Being as Messiah to her creates and sustains oneness and intimacy. Mentioned before about in the 1 Corinthians 7, if I have to convince my wife to be intimate with me, maybe I should realize that there is something in the relationship that is missing, that isn't being done right. Philippians 2, verses 3 through 5. Paul says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look out not only for your own interests, but also for the interests of others. Have this mind in yourself, which is yours in Messiah Yeshua, the same mind that he had. Does this mindset and approach define my marriage and my relationships with others? In order for the oneness that comes about by that to happen, it requires action. Love's not a sentiment. It's not a feeling. It is so much more. It is defined by what each of us, what we do, and who we are. John tells us in 1 John 3:18, don't love in word or just in talk, but in deed and in truth. My sins and their consequences affect all those around me. Affect my spouse. That's true for all of us. From a servant's mindset, the questions that matter are ones like these. Is the power of sin still working in my life? Even though I'm a believer and a follower of Messiah, am I still deceitful? Am I still lustful? Am I still selfish? Am I still angry? Am I still bitter? Do I still have that critical spirit? Do I still have unforgiveness within me? Are there areas in my life I won't allow my wife to talk to me about? Am I being as Messiah to my wife? These are the kinds of questions that the servant should be asking. My wife should have the freedom to point out problems and problem areas in my life. And if there are problems, I need to deal with them. And I need to deal with them now. When the bondservant's master confronted him, the bondservant was going to fix things right away because he was the bondservant and because he loves his master. How long is it until I give up and move past the hurts and the problems from my past that shape my behavior and that cause sinfulness now. I can't lead in my marriage or anywhere else with anger, with guilt, with bitterness, with unforgiveness yet in me. Those are not the attributes of leadership. The wrath, the anger of man does not produce righteousness. Now is the time to confront and deal with it. Paul tells us in Romans 13 that now is the time. The hour has come. Can't keep putting it off. Now is the time. So, to wrap it all up, finally, we are all called to be like Messiah. And that means that we are to serve one another and submit to one another. Servanthood and the humility that goes along with being a servant are the hallmarks of leadership, not being in charge of. The husband is not in charge of the wife. The husband is to be like Messiah to the wife. He should lead by being like Messiah. And if the husband is disobedient, well, then the wife must be the first one to be like Messiah. The wife then must be the one to lead because the husband's not doing it. There's no room in any of this for selfishness. The servant, me, you, cannot be greater than the master, Messiah, and he set the example. He was the example of a servant unto death. Leadership requires fruit of the Spirit, the attributes of Messiah. And ultimately, it's based upon faith in our Father. So ultimately, it's faith in God that we serve a good and faithful master, that we can trust him to take care of us. To be the head is to be the one in front, leading the way, not the master over our fellow servants or fellow heirs. My wife is a fellow heir and a child of God. Do I honor her preciousness and how I treat her? Am I building her up and encouraging her? Do I treat her like fine china? Am I gentle, kind, patient, and understanding? Are my actions contributing to oneness with her? If the answer to any of these questions is no, then I am sinning against her, and I am sinning before my master. Just because there's no strife doesn't mean that there is oneness. It doesn't mean I'm doing it right. Leadership within the marriage, starting with the husband ideally. But if the husband's not doing it, then it must start with the wife. It is applicable for all of us, leads to the proper relationships and oneness that Jehovah intends. So whatever.
Okay. I'm gonna try something real quick now that you're done.
Okay.
I put it in the chat there. If you see, I don't know if you still see that the chat room is still working.
Okay.
What I'm about to do.
Oh, let me see. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Because it's still
so
trying
for a
to
for a
screenshot.
minute or two, you'll be
No
listening.
problem. No
Maybe
problem.
See if this resets your computer.
All right.
All right, Darryl, give it a shot. All right. We're not hearing you now. That didn't work. Um, are you muted? Maybe. Well, no, you're not muted because it's showing on our end you're talking. Yeah, I know. Brian is pointing out that Darryl, why don't you just log out of the meeting, log back in? In the meantime, everyone else can think of a question to ask him, because I think if he logs back out and logs in again, that'll clear up. That works with a lot of people. They run out of RAM or the computer gets taxed, and then they check back. They check out, clears the RAM, and then they check back in. In the meantime, when he comes back, I'm going to open the meeting to a question and answer format. This will open up everybody's mics.
All attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
Okay, we are now in the question and answer mode. And as soon as he logs back in, you can use the interact button on the top to raise your hand, or you can just type in the chat room that you have a question. You should be back here in a second or two. We did a test run of this 2 weeks ago, ran into the same problem, or a slightly different problem. And restarting the meeting seemed to help.
All right. Okay, can you hear me now?
We sure can. Welcome back. Why don't you
All right.
okay, there's your webcam.
I'm getting it. There we go.
Okay.
Okay.
For fun, try sharing your screen again, just briefly.
Oh, yeah. I don't know. Should we do that? Okay, for fun. Here goes. I don't know what's on my screen.
Okay, that's
There you
it.
go.
We had to. Okay, if we run into this again, basically we have to tell our presenter to leave and then come back.
There we go. Okay.
I think we just ran out of RAM. Ran out of RAM. This is very taxing on the presenter's computer. It's not very taxing to someone who's listening, but the presenter really beats the computer up. So, any questions for Darryl? You can either raise your hand using the interact or type in the chat room, hey, I have something to say, or just open your mic and start screaming. No, Okay, it looks like Douglas has a question.
All right. Shall we promote him?
No. You don't promote him. We're in question and answer. By the way, I switched to question and answer mode while you were gone. So all he has to do is go up on top where it says mic and unmute your mic. You just click the microphone thingy on the top. And
so he can do that.
Yes. It's up to him now. Otherwise, he'll have to type his message if he doesn't unmute himself.
Okay, well, Doug, unmute yourself and speak to us or type away because you raised your hand. That's why we're saying that. And in response to Brian, probably Gina's question, yes, we need to put where the notes thing, Don, and I will I will share with you all a link to my slides.
And that's in the meeting notes.
Well, I can do it there, so that's. In fact, I'm going to set them now to make a link for them.
Okay, and then you can put that link in the meeting notes, which is click more where the three buttons are, and it says shared meeting notes. You can just put it there. I believe at the end of the meeting, everybody will get a email with that.
Okay.
Otherwise, if you send that link to your sister, she could probably
It can
put it up
go.
on our website.
All right. We're again. Okay. Here I was. Sorry, I was focusing upon sharing that. So the meeting notes are where?
It says more with the three dots.
Yes. There, I
Click on
got you.
that. It says take meeting notes. Click on that. There's two sets of notes there, your private notes and shared public notes. You put
Okay.
the link there and everybody will have it.
Okay.
There we
Well,
go.
there is a link to the file with all my slides, and it is anybody has that link can view it.
John
Hopefully
and
that
Darryl,
works.
see Douglas's note in the chat room.
All right. He's in the mute twilight zone. Well, Doug, you can come upstairs and come in the room here if you want. As long as, you're welcome to do that. So I'm using my son Ramaya's computer, and it's got 8 gigs of RAM. It's a gaming laptop. It should have been fine with all of this.
Who knows? Who knows?
Well, however, next time I can. Well, I don't know. I said I could do.
Your line is now on.
I heard that. Go ahead.
No, I was trying to. It jumped around on me here.
All right. See, Doug had his hand raised, and he was just downstairs in the basement. So now he's come here. You come around here, because I can do the microphone. However, this is Doug. Let's see if you can hear him, because that should be. All right. We'll see if that works. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, real loud.
Oh, okay, good. That's on the laptop and stuff. I can get those things off my ears. All right. So, go ahead, Doug.
I know my past experiences, before becoming a believer and afterwards, have influenced my understanding of leadership, especially leadership within a marriage and family. And so, it's always good to look at and discuss the subjects, but I just wondered how you might comment in regards to what some of your past or previous experience might have influenced your thinking about leadership within a family and a marriage.
Well, that's a good question and a good point, because we're all affected by that. And see, I can't talk about it too much because my mom and dad are listening. So
Okay.
Teasing.
Discretion is the greater part of valor, I would say.
No, I know that my parents' relationship with one another and with myself and my siblings, from what we've discussed, is different from what your parents' relationship with one another and you and your siblings was. In terms of just the even from physical affection, but as well as in how we related to one another. Mom, don't listen. Dad, don't listen. But my parents aren't perfect. And I've probably known that from when I was just a child. But I know I'm not perfect too. So I can't even really delineate the ways or explain the ways that they've affected me and impacted me and shaped me, because I'm not even all the way aware of that. My approach to marriage and to my wife has been affected by the notion that the husband as the head means he's in charge. He's supposed to make decisions. He's supposed to do these things. And at times what that meant is that I shut her down. Not like I know in some other situations in some marriages that the husband is much more of a Mr. Command type than I am. That's not really my type of doing things. But there have been times it's been difficult because having that notion. But there also have been a lot of times that, I've been quite willing and happy to serve my wife because I love her, and because I've seen examples of that in my own parents. And so that has made a difference. That has affected me. And there are times, there are still times that I get frustrated because she doesn't understand something the way I do, or she doesn't value something, and I have to just kind of chuckle to myself, or chuckle because even when I get frustrated, I know what my Father is doing, that Yehovah is telling me, hey, you need to learn something here. And one of those ways is in punctuality, in being on time. I learned that you don't be late, you be early. And so I manage time in a certain way, or I think I do. And then I stand around waiting for others, children, and sometimes Anne, to catch up with me or to be ready. And you know what? A lot of those times it just really doesn't matter. This is one of those things that I have set as I need to do this and you need to do it too, but that they don't really. And that it's an opportunity for me to realize that I oftentimes haven't communicated well the importance it is to me. And so I have an expectation that is unrealistic. And I am not bearing in mind what's going on that's making it not possible for her to meet my expectations. And so in that way, I'm not being fair to her. I'm not treating her the way I would want to be treated myself, actually. So that's just one little sort of example, but there's still ways that I'm still learning about how to lay down my life, and also recognize in the process when I get frustrated and have a hard time that it is an opportunity for me to learn and grow. I've got to be in Phoenix by sundown. Yes, there is that. I'm just trying to see those comments on there. I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, Doug, but I'm sure we'll have opportunity to talk about it more.
My thought was that in the areas that I do well, it's because I think I'm sensitive to the Holy Spirit and what that is engendering in my life. And where I do badly is oftentimes from some of the past negative influences I've had. And so I think not unlike most people, it's the way I process things.
Okay. Any other comments or questions or whatever anybody wants to bring up? Because there are so many ways some of this stuff, when we talk about leadership and the implications of it, that it can go. In fact, like I said, I spent a lot of times just paring some things down, and I still went a lot longer in time than I thought, because everything kept showing up. There were so many scriptures, so many passages that were applicable. So if you have something you want, step up to the mic. It's just waiting there for you.
bashful crowd tonight.
Well, that's fine, I guess. Let's see. Oh, I know. Make sure also if you want, make sure my email address, if you want to email the question or anything, put that in the meeting notes also. If you put this on YouTube, if you want to put the link to the slides, those are available for whoever wants to view them. That's fine to have them on there in the description, however.
I'll have to figure out how to do that. I mean, I'm new to doing the YouTube administration kind of thing.
Okay.
Brian, are you using a tablet? Are you using your Apple stuff? Because I'm getting text messages that people are trying to tune in using mobile devices and they're just not cooperating. And there's 2 iPads and an iPhone that are not cooperating. And Brian's an I person. So if you're an I person or a Mac person and you're selfish, does that make you a me person? Sorry, I just had to do that. Okay, well.
Okay. Well, I'm good at this point. I'm glad it's Sabbath, and I hope that everyone is blessed in this Sabbath. And Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Okay.
All right, at this point, I'm going to stop. Oh, wait. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. There we go.
Okay.